Welcome back to another episode of Deep Quotes. This is Dee.
This is App.
And this is Pod.
And today we have a quote from Canada's new Minister of the Middle Class Prosperity. Her name is Mona Fortier. The quote is, quote, "I define the middle class as where people feel that they can afford their way of life. They have a quality of life, and they can have, send their kids to play hockey or even have different activities. It's having the cost of living where you can do what you want with your families," end quote. And this is when she was being questioned by CBC Radio's The Current, asking about how do you define the middle class? Because she is becoming the Minister of Middle Class Prosperity, so she should have a definition for that. What are your thoughts on this?
So I understand that this is a off-the-cuff definition of how she's going to define the middle class.
It's during an interview.
But, how you define something can vary from person to person. I think that this was not necessarily a great way to describe the middle class. She probably should have just pulled out some numbers and then described this as a follow-up. But I think kind of her point here is that middle class are people who have some level of disposable income so that they are not necessarily making, do I eat today or do I pay the lights today?
Sure, but she's also talking about, she's bringing in hockey into it. And I realize that hockey is much more prevalent in Canada than a lot of other places in the world, but Canada is also fairly dispersely populated. Mm-hmm. That most of the landmass doesn't have population. And so even where it is populated, the town may not have enough money to have an ice rink, even if it's fairly well off. So hockey is an interesting example to me because even if you are really, really rich and you're living really well, your area just may not have a hockey rink.
Yeah, but I mean, those areas that are very dispersed, let's face it, they're up north. You can make a hockey rink.
Sure.
But I don't...
Her point is the ability to get more of the hockey gear. So in like the United States, it would be more of, am I playing soccer, am I playing basketball, or am I playing football?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Her point is more like, can you afford for your kids to have some kind of extracurricular activity without it bankrupting you or causing you to starve?
Sure.
And I think that was more her point.
Sure. But I think it's not...
It's not a great point.
It's not a great point, and it doesn't scale. This doesn't tell me anything about where she believes the middle class lies, because soccer, you need to be soccer is universal around the world because it's like, I have a ball, I have two sticks as a goalpost, I can kick the ball. You don't need shoes, you just need a ball of some form. Basketball, you need a little bit more, but it's similar as long as you have a ball, so a relatively flat surface, you can tend to play that. Their track and field, you need to be able to run. A lot of sports, you don't need that much setup to be able to do. So you can have a lot of choices in what types of extracurricular activities you can do without being in the middle class. Mm-hmm. You can be poor and have quite a few options of what sorts of activities you want to take part in. And that's part of this quote, is talking about the activities that kids can play. But I think the end part of this quote, which is, it's having the cost of living where you can do what you want with your families.
Yeah, that really rubs me the wrong way, because the thing is, for me to be able to do what I want with my family, it's going to be really expensive. Mm-hmm. Imagine I have a partner and 2 kids. Okay, well, I want to take my family to Antarctica. Those trips cost $10,000 plus American dollars.
Per person.
If I was to take my kids on that trip, that is not middle class. That's not what people typically think of.
That would be upper class.
Right.
And to be just the way that she phrases it, of do what you want with your families. No matter how rich you are, you always want more money. You always want the ability to go one rung up in the ladder, earn more, and be able to do more. Man, I took that trip to Antarctica, and we do it every year. I'd really like to just kind of constantly be on a cruise going throughout the world. And there is a class of society where I think there's 1 or 2 cruise ships now that you can just buy an apartment there and live there the entire time, and they go around the entire world once a year as a retirement plan, basically. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, that's not middle class, I'm sure, but that's what they want, and they probably want more. They'd like to have their own ship, but they can't afford their own yacht to go around. Saying that you are no longer in want is stupid, because people are always in want.
Right. And I think that definition of the middle class also doesn't really scale well to different areas of a country, because what people want in a large city is going to be very different than what they're wanting if they live in the country.
Sure. If you're in the country, maybe it's, I want to be able to haul stuff around. I want a pickup truck, an old rundown pickup truck that's a couple $1,000s. Oh, I'm in the city. I want my own apartment. That's going to run you several $1,000s a month.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the cost of living where you can do what you want with your families, part of that quote is, it is very over exaggerated, because people can want anything, right? And what do you want to do? How much does that actually cost? So I think focusing more on that first part of like, send your kids to play hockey. It's like, okay, it means you can afford to pay a couple $100s a year for their hockey fees.
Sure.
And that's more, I think the amount of money that she was thinking about was you can afford to have these extracurricular activities that are quote unquote normal. Now, who defines what's normal?
And she doesn't define what's
her.
normal here.
Right.
And also with the first part of the quote of, I define the middle class as where people feel they can afford their way of life. Anyone can get into a bankrupt position. If you're overspending, and like, let's say that you do want to send all of your kids to hockey and football, and you end up spending way too much, and you have too expensive of cars, and you wanted to have 4 cars, but you can't afford that, and now you go bankrupt. Collections agencies are coming out. It's like, well, I can't afford my way of life.
Well, I think the bigger part is that you are reasonably able to achieve a comfortable life, not necessarily an extravagant life, right? That if you live in a city where you can get a 2-bedroom apartment for $1,200, that you're not just making $1,400 a month.
Yeah.
Like,
but all of this, none of what we're talking about is the middle class and what the middle class has always historically been, which is the class that occupies the middle of the profits, I guess maybe not profit, but overall value hierarchy. It's like the middle class, very easy definition. If I were to become the minister of the middle class prosperity, if you take everyone that is making money in your country, take the average, the middle 50% of everyone that earns, chop off the bottom 25% and the top 25% of people, that middle 50% is the middle class because it's in the middle. There's a very clear-cut definition that you can use, and at least a jumping off point, as opposed to a wishy-washy, oh, well, it has to do with quality of life. No, that's not middle class. That has to do with, where do you want people to be able to live, and what do you view as an acceptable quality of life, which has incredibly changed from year to year and over the past couple of centuries. That as we have refrigeration, well, is refrigeration part of middle class? It's like, if you define at any point in time, these are the things that define middle class, that goalpost is going to be constantly moving in an unpredictable way, because you can't have specific pieces of quality of life. So like refrigeration or being able to play hockey, those things may become much more standardized in the future. And so if you solidify them as part of your definition now, that's going to drastically change in the future. Income will also change in the future, but in a much more adjustable way, because every year you say, all right, what is our current average income? What is that middle 50%? We can very easily change it, and it's not a subjective thing. Her quote is a subjective definition, which is completely meaningless because it's her personal subjective definition and not something that can be applied universally across the country.
Right. It would be different if she started off with mentioning like, okay, this is the income band of that middle 50%. I see it as this.
Yes.
Yeah,
but that's not what she did.
And it sounds like in her interviews that she was deflecting on exactly how she wanted to define it, and she was trying to keep to this wishy-washy thing.
And in the article that we'll have listed in the description, they tried to find how the middle class is defined in Canada, and they were supposedly only able to find one example from several years ago where after being pushed multiple times that he gave, well, here's the median income in Canada. It's like, but that doesn't define the middle class. And it sounds to me like they're intentionally keeping middle class as being a subjective definition rather than an objective definition, so that they can say, oh, well, everyone should have this and we should aim to have everyone in the middle class, which is not a capitalist idea. That is a Marxist idea. And by the way, the term of minister of middle class prosperity sounds a lot like minister of bourgeois prosperity, which bourgeoisie is basically just the middle class of Marxist systems. And if you keep the definition very broad and something where only the government knows really what their goal is and what's trying to go on, you can define it however you want and redistribute wealth to the point where everyone is part of the middle class. To make sure that everyone is in the middle class, you bring down people on the top, decrease their quality of life, and continue decreasing quality of life until everyone is at the same quality of life.
Well, I think it's that, and it's also that people don't like some of the politically charged language associated with defining the difference between middle class and lower class.
Mm-hmm. Because then you have to define a lower class.
Yeah.
Right.
In capitalist societies, there's this idea of like, oh, well, poor people are really just displaced millionaires. Like, they're just a millionaire who's down on their luck. They just happen to not have their millions right now, but they will one day.
Sure.
And so if you try to define what the middle class is, you inherently have to say, oh yeah, by the way, people who make less than that are now the lower class, and no one wants to be called lower class. And those of you who make more than that are now the upper class, and that goalpost is often a lot lower than you think it would be. And so people who are like, I'm just barely making ends meet, what do you mean by I'm upper class?
Mm-hmm. And as soon as you define it objectively, it can become very offensive to people who don't make those objective measurements. And I think that if you're in a position where you view statistics and objective measurements of, if you just take that middle 50%, that we don't care what the average is. All we're saying is reporting on what that middle 50% earns. This is the middle class by statistical analysis. If that will put 25% of the population in lower class. It's not intended to be offensive, but if you view as labeling anyone as being lower class, then you're not going to be able to follow an objective measure, and you can't make objective decisions. And I think that people in government should be able to make objective decisions. And if you can't say there is a person out there that is the poorest person in the country, that's not disparaging them. It's a statement of fact. And if you can't bring yourself to make objective statements, you have no business managing money, because money is nothing but managing objective numbers. And she is basically saying that she can't give an objective definition, which I think disqualifies her from being she should not be in this position.
Yeah. Though you did just remind me of something. There is a difference between looking at someone's sort of class level based on their income versus looking at their net worth. So let's say someone just graduated from medical school and they have racked up $500,000 in student loan debt.
They're worth negative $500,000.
Which that totally happens. They could be making $100,000 a year straight out of college. You know, they have their MD and they are worth negative $500,000. So are you considering that person to be an upper class person because they make $100,000, or are they basically poverty level because
they're paying off all these loans?
They're worth so little that it's laughable to the rest of society that someone could be worth that little.
And I think that you're bringing up a good point in the sense that how do you measure the value of a human life? Because
not life.
Well, not right, but you're trying to measure the differences in how much a person is worth.
Mm-hmm.
And if you start putting a label on how much someone is worth, that means that some people are worth more than other people. And that's a differentiation that not everyone is comfortable with making.
I mean, I was just pointing out more from the perspective of net worth. A lot of people that we consider to be the richest among us are actually the poorest among us. And those of us that we consider to be very poor actually have quite a bit of net worth. It's just
And honestly,
they're better at handling money.
and a lot of what it comes down to is just how you perceive yourself.
Yep.
A lot of people that are poor are also very, very happy. If you're poor, let's say you work 50 hours a week, but you are able to spend time with your family, and maybe you can't send your kids off to do a bunch of sports, but that means that you're spending all of the time at home with your kids. You're just making ends meet. You can feed yourself, you can house yourself, but besides that, you're just at home with your kids. You can still be very happy. And on the flip side, I've heard many stories of people that are working 70, 80, 90 hours a week as like lawyers or doctors, where they rarely see their families and have terrible relations with their kids and end up not being happy at all. Happiness is not necessarily correlated to amount of money and amount of decisions. There probably is some sort of correlation to it, but really I think the studies that have been done, once you can pay the minimum bills, money has very little effect on happiness.
Right. That's what I've seen, is there's a point where you can pay your bills. You have a little bit left over maybe to get some of those things that you want, but generally you don't need to be making a ton.
But the point at which you're paying your bills is not middle class.
Right.
And I think that's an important point to realize, that you can pay your bills with very little money. And if you can't afford paying the $1,000 or $2,000 or $3,000 a month for an apartment in the city, guess what? Don't live in the city. It means that you won't, you lose that choice of being able to choose whether you live in the country or in the city. But guess what? People in the city want to live in different parts of the city, and they have to choose between an apartment that they can afford. And the less money you make, the fewer choices you have. That doesn't mean that you're not in the middle class. The middle class should be defined based on the average income across people across the country, so that it's an objective definition, not a subjective one of how happy people are, because that has nothing to do with prosperity. That has to do with happiness. And if you're appointing people as ministers of prosperity and you're defining those successes as subjective measurements of happiness, it's moronic. It will never get anywhere, and it's another pointless government position. And by the way, she's going into this position not knowing what the job is actually supposed to be about, and that's what came up during this interview. Is she doesn't have an objective definition of it. She doesn't actually know what the position is going to be doing, and it's super wishy-washy, because it's like, look, we're just going to be virtue signaling and try to get the bourgeoisie on our side. That's how this article comes across to me.
Well, I mean, she's the first ever minister of middle-class prosperity. It's not like someone else has done it before.
But if you're going to appoint someone at a position, you should have an idea of what that position is supposed to be doing.
Yeah,
right.
They probably should have, made a job description, had some flowcharts and PowerPoints, given her some information.
And here's
Exactly.
how the middle class is defined, and it's your job to try and ensure that definition continues to move up, and that people become more prosperous and move from middle class to upper class. That's what she should be aiming for.
Yeah.
That's what this position should be, and based on the fact that she can't answer these questions, it's insulting to me, even though I'm not in Canada.
Yeah, I think the bigger part of her job is she's probably just going to be more focusing on, what are the things that people in this so-called middle class that she has made up in her mind, what are the things that they care about, and how do we help out with that? Which does not quite sound like, how do we make sure the middle class makes more money, and is more, how do we make sure the middle class has warm, fuzzy feelings?
But it has prosperity in the name of her position, which kind of implies that they're going to be talking about money.
Or warm, fuzzy feelings, because prosperity can be defined as happiness.
But we don't know if it's about money or warm, fuzzy feelings,
I don't
because
think
she
she
doesn't
knows.
know.
Exactly!
So, all right. Anything else we want to rip on this poor woman for?
I think we've done enough.
Pod?
I think she's heard enough from us uneducated Americans about her job title.
All right. Well, Mona, if you do have a definition, we'd love to hear it. Otherwise, I'll read the quote one more time again from Mona Fortier, the Minister of Middle Class Prosperity and Associate Minister of Finance. I apologize. I left that off of her title. It's a long title. And it's, quote, I define the middle class as where people feel that they can afford their way of life, they have a quality of life, and they can have, send their kids to play hockey or even have different activities. It's having a cost of living where you can do what you want with your families, end quote. So thanks for listening. And we'll see you guys next time. The content of this podcast does not reflect the views and opinions held by anyone involved. We will frequently be playing the devil's advocate strictly for the purpose of exploration of ideas and not as an endorsement of any subsequent action. We condemn all acts of violence other than those of self-defense against physical harm.